The fluorescent lights of Hartwell Tower flickered twice before the emergency alarm split the morning silence. On the 42nd floor, screens went dark, elevators froze between levels, and the central HVAC system began pumping air at dangerous pressure rates. Within minutes, the building's nerve center had descended into controlled chaos. Melanie Cross arrived at the operations hub 17 minutes after the first alarm, her heels striking the polished concrete with the rhythm of someone who expected doors to open before she reached them. At 32, she had already climbed higher than most executives twice her age, and she wore her authority like a second skin. Her eyes swept across the room, cataloging faces, assessing competence, dismissing anything that fell outside her immediate chain of command. A man in gray coveralls stood near the east corridor, a mop bucket beside him, his attention fixed on something beyond the glass partition. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered to Meline's calculus of usefulness. When one of her junior analysts glanced in his direction, perhaps considering whether to consult him about the ventilation patterns, Meline's voice cut through the noise. "He's just a janitor." The words landed with surgical precision, severing any possibility of consultation. The man in gray turned slightly, not toward Meline, but toward the hallway, where a small girl with braided hair sat on a plastic chair, her backpack too large for her frame, her eyes watching everything with quiet intensity. Evan Rowe had worked the night shift at Hartwell Tower for 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days. He knew this because Lucy had started kindergarten on his first day, and now she was finishing second grade. Time moved differently when you measured it in parent-teacher conferences and growth spurts, rather than quarterly reports and performance reviews. His hands told the story of those years better than any resume. Calluses layered over calluses, small scars from chemical burns that came with industrial cleaning solutions, a permanent roughness that no amount of moisturizer could soften. He had learned to keep them in his pockets when meeting Lucy's teachers, had noticed how their eyes would drift downward. Cataloging, categorizing, filing him away in the mental folder marked working class, probably limited education, unlikely to cause problems or provide solutions. The night shift suited him, in ways he rarely examined too closely. The building breathed differently after midnight, its mechanical systems humming in frequencies that most people never noticed. Evan noticed. He noticed the slight vibration in the west stairwell that indicated the fire suppression system needed recalibration. He noticed the temperature differential between floors 39 and 40 that suggested ductwork degradation. He noticed patterns in the way the elevator motors cycled, the rhythm of the backup generators, the subtle complaints of a building that spoke only to those patient enough to listen. Lucy had started accompanying him on weekend shifts after his mother's health declined, and childcare became another impossible equation to solve. She would sit in the break room with her homework, or sometimes walk beside him as he made his rounds, asking questions that cut through the darkness like small flashlights. "Daddy, why do some people not say hi to us?" "They're busy, sweetheart." But the lady in the red shoes said hi to the man with the briefcase. He was busy, too. Evan had learned to navigate these conversations the way he navigated the building's service corridors, knowing which turns led to dead ends and which opened into larger spaces. He never lied to Lucy, but he had become skilled at editing reality into shapes a 7-year-old could hold without cutting herself. Madeleine Cross existed in a different universe entirely, one where value was measured in credentials and quarterly projections, where a person's worth could be calculated from their title and corner office square footage. She had graduated summa cum laude. From Wharton had spent 4 years at Mackenzie, learning to see organizations as systems of optimizable components, had been recruited to Hartwell Properties with a compensation package that would have covered Evan's salary for 15 years. Her success was genuine, built on intelligence and relentless work ethic, but it had calcified into something brittle. She trusted data over intuition, process over instinct, credentials over capability. In her framework, a janitor was a line item in the facility's budget, a function rather than a person, certainly not someone whose observations might hold value in a crisis. The phrase, "just a janitor," had not been calculated cruelty. It was simply the natural output of a system that sorted humans into hierarchies of relevance. Meline had spoken it the way one might say, just a Tuesday, or just a coffee. The words had weight only because Evan was there to receive them, and because Lucy, watching from her plastic chair, had begun to understand that the world divided people into categories that had nothing to do with who they actually were. The crisis deepened throughout the morning. Initial diagnostics pointed to a cascading failure in the building's integrated management system, a network of sensors, actuators, and control algorithms that governed everything from lighting to life safety. The system had been installed 18 months earlier at considerable expense, marketed as a cutting-edge solution that would reduce operational costs by 40% while improving occupant comfort and safety. It had performed exactly as promised until it hadn't. Evan continued his work in the margins of the emergency, emptying trash bins that still needed emptying, cleaning surfaces that still needed cleaning, maintaining the illusion of normalcy in a building that was slowly forgetting how to function. But his attention remained fixed on the operations hub, on the screens displaying error codes and system maps, on the conversations filtering through partially open doors. He recognized the pattern. It was subtle, buried beneath layers of diagnostic noise, but it was there, a feedback loop in the pressure regulation subsystem, likely triggered by a sensor calibration drift that had been accumulating for months. The building wasn't failing randomly, it was responding logically to bad information, like a person making reasonable decisions based on false premises. During a brief lull, when the operations team had scattered to make phone calls and the hub stood nearly empty, Evan approached one of the junior technicians. His voice was quiet, differential, shaped by years of understanding his place in other people's hierarchies. The pressure readings on 41, they're cycling in a pattern. Might want to check the reference sensors against the backup calibration logs from last October. The technician looked up, confusion flickering across his face. Before he could respond, another voice cut in from behind. He's just a janitor. He doesn't understand this. The speaker was a facilities manager named Derek, someone Evan had worked alongside for 2 years without ever having a conversation that extended beyond scheduling. Derek's words weren't malicious. They were simply accurate within the framework everyone accepted. Janitors cleaned, engineers diagnosed. The categories were clear, and crossing them created disorder. Evan nodded once and stepped back, returning to his cart, to his mop, to the role the world had assigned him. But that night, as he walked Lucy to his mother's apartment, she asked a question that lodged itself beneath his ribs. "Daddy, when you told that man about the building, why didn't he listen?" "Sometimes people only hear certain voices, Lucy, but your voice works fine, I can hear you." He squeezed her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't teach her something he wasn't ready for her to learn. By the following afternoon, the situation had deteriorated beyond Meline's carefully constructed contingency plans. The pressure irregularities had spread to additional floors. 2 elevators had locked in safety mode, trapping occupants for nearly an hour before manual overrides could be implemented. The HVAC system had begun cycling between extremes, creating temperature swings that made several floors uninhabitable, and the fire suppression system had started showing intermittent false readings that threatened to trigger evacuation protocols across the entire building. Meline had brought in 3 external consultants, each with impressive credentials and hourly rates that would have made Evan's head spin. They had run diagnostics, analyzed data streams, and produced reports filled with technical language and confident recommendations. None of their solutions had worked. Each fix seemed to trigger new failures, as if the building itself was rejecting their interventions. The pressure on Meline was immense and growing. Hartwell Tower housed 12 major corporate tenants, including a law firm with partners who billed more per hour than most people earned in a week. Every minute of disruption translated to liability, exposure, tenant complaints, and questions from the ownership group about whether their young, fast-rising executive was actually equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude. She responded the only way she knew how, by tightening her grip. More meetings, more directives, more insistence that the solution would come from following proper channels, consulting appropriate experts, trusting the process that had served her throughout her career. If the outside consultants couldn't solve it, she would bring in more consultants. If the current protocols weren't working, she would develop new protocols. The answer had to exist within the system because the system was all she had ever trusted. Evan watched from his position in the shadows, invisible in the way that all service workers learn to be. He saw the consultants chasing symptoms rather than causes, implementing fixes that addressed the surface manifestations while leaving the underlying feedback loop untouched. He saw Meline's confidence beginning to crack at the edges, her voice growing sharper, her decisions more reactive, and he saw the pattern continuing to evolve, spreading through the building systems like an infection that no one was treating because no one had correctly diagnosed the disease. His notebook sat in his locker 3 floors down, filled with observations accumulated over years of night shifts, temperature logs, pressure readings, notes about system behaviors that seemed insignificant individually but formed patterns when viewed together. He had never shown it to anyone, had never considered that it might have value to people who had degrees and titles and offices with windows. That evening, Meline found herself alone in the operations hub, staring at screens that displayed data she could no longer interpret with confidence. The consultants had left for the day, promising fresh perspectives in the morning. Her team had dispersed to handle tenant complaints and coordinate with building security. For the first time in her career, she felt genuinely uncertain about what to do next. She noticed the gray, uniformed figure in the corridor, the same man she had dismissed 2 days earlier pushing a cleaning cart past the glass partition. Something made her pause, some fragment of memory that didn't fit her usual categories. He had said something about pressure readings, about calibration logs. She shook off the thought and returned to her screens, but the seed had been planted, a hairline crack in the certainty that had always defined her. 2 hours later, she was still there, still searching for answers in data that refused to yield them. Evan had finished his rounds on the 42nd floor and had returned for his cart, which he had left near the hub entrance. As he collected it, he noticed a spiral notebook had fallen from his pocket onto the floor. He bent to retrieve it, and several loose pages scattered across the polished concrete. Meline heard the rustling and looked up, irritation already forming on her face. But what she saw through the glass stopped her. The janitor was kneeling on the floor, gathering pages covered in handwritten diagrams, equations, and system maps that looked far more sophisticated than anything a cleaning employee should possess. She found herself standing, walking toward the door, pushing it open before the rational part of her brain could intervene. What is that? Evan looked up, his expression carefully neutral. For a moment, he considered deflecting, minimizing, retreating into the safe invisibility of his assigned role. But something in Meline's face suggested that the barriers between them had shifted, if only slightly. Observations from the night shifts. She reached down and picked up one of the pages. Her eyes moved across it, recognizing elements of the building's mechanical systems, seeing annotations that demonstrated genuine understanding. The handwriting was precise, the analysis methodical. These were not the scribblings of a curious amateur. These were the notes of someone who understood complex systems at a fundamental level. "You have an engineering background." It was not a question, but Evan answered anyway. "I did." Before what? He gathered the remaining pages, tucked them back into the notebook, and stood. For a long moment, he was silent, weighing how much of himself to reveal to someone who had dismissed him without a second thought before my wife died. Before I became a single father with a 7-year-old who needed me present, not traveling to job sites and working 80-hour weeks. Before I chose a life that let me be there for her school plays and her nightmares and her questions about why the world works the way it does. Meline's face shifted, something softening behind her professional mask. She looked at the notebook in his hands, then at the screens behind her, showing the crisis that continued to evolve despite all her expertise and resources. "The pressure readings, you mentioned the calibration logs. You know what's causing this? I have a theory. Why didn't you say something?" Evan's smile was gentle without bitterness. "I did, but I'm just a janitor. I don't understand these things." The words hung between them, reflecting something back at Meline that she didn't want to see. She stood there in her designer suit, her Warden degree, her Mackenzie pedigree, and she felt something she had not felt in years. genuine uncertainty about the framework through which she understood the world. The crisis reached its inflection point on the morning of the fourth day. An overnight cascade had spread the pressure irregularities to the life safety systems, creating a situation where the building's fire suppression network was receiving contradictory signals that could trigger either false activations or dangerous failures to respond to actual emergencies. The city fire marshal had been notified, and a mandatory evacuation was being discussed for the following morning if the situation could not be resolved. Milan had not slept in 36 hours. The consultants had expanded their team to 7 specialists, none of whom could agree on a diagnosis or a solution. The ownership group had scheduled a call for that afternoon, and Milan understood that her career at Hartwell Properties was now measured in hours rather than years. She found Evan in the 41st floor mechanical room, performing routine maintenance on equipment that most people in the building didn't know existed. He looked up as she entered, and she saw no surprise in his eyes, as if he had been expecting her. "I need your help." The words cost her more than she had anticipated. She had built her identity on competence, on being the person who solved problems rather than the person who asked for solutions. Admitting that she needed assistance from someone she had publicly dismissed felt like a fundamental compromise of everything she had worked to become. Evan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He thought about the risks, the very real possibility that his theory was wrong, that implementing it would make things worse, that he would fail publicly in a way that would confirm everyone's assumptions about janitors and their limitations. He thought about Lucy, about what it would mean for her if her father became known as the cleaning man, who had made a crisis worse through his hubris. But he also thought about the people in the building, the thousands of workers who were being affected by systems they didn't understand and couldn't control. He thought about the families waiting at home, the children wondering why their parents were working late again, the elderly residents on the upper floors who were struggling with temperature swings and elevator failures. The building was full of people who were in their own ways invisible to the systems that governed their daily lives. "What do you need me to do?" Milan asked. "I need access to the central control room. I need your authorization to bypass some of the standard protocols, and I need everyone to stay out of my way for about 4 hours. The consultants will want to observe." "No, they'll want to intervene. They'll see what I'm doing, and they'll try to stop it, because it doesn't match their models. Either you trust me to handle this, or you keep trusting them. But you can't do both." Milan's jaw tightened. Everything in her training screamed against this, handing control to an uncredentialed unknown, bypassing the experts, abandoning the process that had always served her. But the process had failed. The experts had failed. And somewhere beneath the professional armor she had constructed over decades, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about what qualified someone to solve problems. 4 hours. "I'll keep everyone clear, but if this doesn't work, then you'll have someone to blame who was never supposed to succeed anyway. A janitor who got above his station. Your reputation stays intact." The honesty of it surprised her. He was offering her an out, a way to protect herself regardless of the outcome. It was the kind of strategic thinking she would have expected from a seasoned executive, not from a man who spent his nights emptying trash bins and mopping floors. "Lucy's? With your mother?" The question came without planning, and Milan saw something shift in Evan's face at the mention of his daughter. "She's at the end of the hall. She wanted to come with me today." Milan looked past him through the small window in the mechanical room door and saw the girl sitting in a plastic chair with a coloring book. Her attention focused entirely on the page in front of her. She was wearing the same oversized backpack, the same patient expression, as if waiting was simply what children did when their fathers had important work to finish. "Okay," Milan said. 4 hours. Show me what you need." The central control room hummed with the low frequency of servers and cooling systems that most employees never heard. Evan stood before the main interface, his gray coveralls incongruous against the sleek technology surrounding him. Milan had cleared the space as promised, posting security at both entrances with instructions that no one was to enter under any circumstances. Evan worked in silence, his hands moving across keyboards and touchscreens with a fluency that revealed years of suppressed expertise. He was not fixing the system in the conventional sense. He was listening to it, tracing the pathways of its confusion, following the threads of bad data back to their source. The feedback loop he had identified was more complex than he had initially suspected. It had begun 18 months earlier, when the integrated management system was first installed. A single sensor in the pressure regulation network had been calibrated against an incorrect reference point, a tiny error that should have been caught during commissioning but had slipped through quality control. Over time, the error had propagated, teaching the system to compensate for readings that were never accurate in the first place, creating a cascade of corrections that were logical, individually, but catastrophic collectively. The consultants had been treating symptoms because they trusted the system's baseline assumptions. They had adjusted algorithms, replaced components, and redesigned protocols without ever questioning whether the foundation itself was flawed. Evan understood that the solution required not fixing the system, but teaching it to distrust itself, to rebuild its reference points from scratch. It took 3 hours and 47 minutes. He worked without breaks, without food, without the comfort of validation from anyone who might have recognized what he was doing. The screens flickered with activity as he methodically dismantled the system's learned behaviors and replaced them with new calibration protocols that acknowledged the original error and compensated for its effects. When the final sequence completed, the building seemed to exhale. The pressure readings stabilized. The temperature swings dampened. The fire suppression system returned to reliable operation. On screens throughout the operations hub, error codes that had persisted for days began clearing, replaced by the steady green indicators of normal function. Meline watched through the glass partition as Evan stepped back from the console and stood motionless for a long moment, his shoulders slightly bowed, his eyes fixed on something beyond the screens in front of him. He did not celebrate. He did not call for acknowledgement. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what he had done and what it had cost him to do it. She entered the control room and stopped a few feet behind him, close enough to speak without raising her voice. "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't, but I understood the building. The consultants understood the system. Those aren't the same thing." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that she had not expected. Not triumph, not vindication, but a kind of quiet grief. Solving the problem had required him to reveal himself, to step out of the comfortable invisibility that had protected him for years. He was no longer just a janitor, which meant he could no longer be invisible, which meant the world would have new expectations he might not be able to meet. The operations hub filled slowly with people who had been waiting for news, for resolution, for someone to tell them that the crisis was over. They looked at the screens, at the green indicators, at the stable readings that had seemed impossible hours earlier, and then they looked at Evan standing in his gray coveralls in the center of the room. And they began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. No one said, "Just a janitor." The phrase had lost its meaning, or perhaps it had finally revealed its meaning as the hollow dismissal it had always been. Meline remained in the building long after the immediate celebration had faded. She sat alone in her office, door closed, lights dimmed, replaying the past 4 days in her mind with the uncomfortable precision of someone who was accustomed to learning from mistakes. She had been wrong about Evan, but the error ran deeper than a single misjudgment. She had been wrong about the entire framework through which she evaluated human capability. Her system of categories, credentials, titles and degrees, and organizational charts had been designed to simplify decision-making, to help her quickly identify who was worth listening to and who could be safely ignored. It had served her well in environments where those categories correlated reliably with competence. But Hartwell Tower had revealed the flaw in that system. A person's job title told you something about their economic circumstances, but nothing about their intelligence, their knowledge, or their potential contribution to solving problems. Evan had possessed the answer to a crisis that had baffled 7 credentialed consultants, and he had possessed it from the beginning. The only barrier to accessing that answer had been Meline's own certainty about who was qualified to provide it. She thought about all the other Evan Rows she had likely encountered over the years, people with hidden depths and unexpected capabilities who had been sorted into categories that prevented anyone from seeing them clearly. She thought about the cumulative cost of those missed opportunities, not just to the individuals themselves, but to the organizations and systems that had failed to benefit from their contributions. The shame was uncomfortable, but it was productive. Meline had not built her career by avoiding uncomfortable truths. She had built it by confronting them, by accepting feedback that others might reject, by treating failures as information rather than verdicts. This failure was no different, except that it was more personal, more revealing of blind spots she had not known she possessed. Heaven did not seek recognition in the days that followed. He returned to his night shifts, to his cleaning cart, to the rhythms of maintenance and care that had defined his life since leaving engineering. But the building treated him differently now. People nodded when they passed him in corridors. The operations team consulted him informally about system behaviors that concerned them. His expertise had been revealed, and there was no way to unreveal it. Lucy noticed the change before Evan did. "Daddy," that man said. "Good morning, Mr. Rowe to you." He did. "Why did he call you Mr. Rowe?" Evan considered his answer carefully, the way he always did with Lucy. "Because he learned something about me that he didn't know before, and it changed how he sees me." What did he learn? That I know things? That I can help when there's trouble? That I'm more than the job I do? Lucy was quiet for a moment, processing this in her 7-year-old way. "I already knew those things." "I know you did, sweetheart." "So why didn't he?" The question had no easy answer. So Evan gave her the true one. Because sometimes people can only see what they expect to see. It takes something unusual to help them see differently. Meline found him on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after the crisis had been resolved. She had composed and discarded a dozen versions of what she wanted to say, each one feeling either too formal or too casual, too apologetic or not apologetic enough. In the end, she decided to simply speak honestly and accept whatever response he offered. The mechanical room on 41 had become something of an unofficial meeting space, a quiet corner of the building where Evan could be found when he was not actively cleaning. She knocked on the door frame, even though it was open, and waited until he looked up from his notebook. "Do you have a moment?" He nodded, and set the notebook aside, giving her his full attention. "I wanted to apologize, not for asking for your help for everything that came before, the way I dismissed you, the way I spoke about you, as if you weren't a person worth considering. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Heaven studied her face, looking for something beneath the words. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. "You were operating from a certain framework. Most people do. It's not personal. That's generous of you. More generous than I deserve, maybe. But I've learned that holding on to resentment doesn't make anything better. It just takes up space that could be used for something else." Meline nodded slowly, accepting the grace he offered without trying to deflect or minimize it. "If you ever wanted to come back to engineering, I could make some calls. You clearly have the capability. I appreciate that. But I chose this life for a reason. Lucy needs a father who's present, not a resume that looks impressive. Maybe someday that will change. Maybe she'll grow up and need me less and I'll want to do something different. But for now, this is where I belong." Even though people don't see you for who you really are, Evan's smile was gentle. The same smile he gave Lucy when she asked questions that had no easy answers. "The people who matter see me. Lucy sees me. My mother sees me. And now you see me. That's probably enough." The sound of small footsteps interrupted them, and Lucy appeared in the doorway, her backpack hanging off one shoulder, her expression curious. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, lady." "Lucy, this is Miss Cross. She works in the big office upstairs." Lucy looked at Meline with the unguarded assessment that only children can manage. "You're the one who said Daddy was just a janitor." Meline felt the heat rise in her face, shame compounded by the clarity of a child's memory. "I did say that, and I was wrong. Your daddy is much more than that." Lucy nodded seriously. "I know. He knows everything about this building. He tells me stories about the machines at night. He solved a really big problem for us. A problem that a lot of other people couldn't solve. That's because he listens." Lucy said as if this explained everything. "He says, people forget to listen." Meline looked at Evan. something shifting in her understanding. He's right. People do forget to listen. Lucy nodded again, apparently satisfied that the adult had grasped the essential point and tugged at her father's sleeve. Can we go get pizza? Sure, sweetheart. Just give me 5 minutes. Lucy wandered back into the corridor, and Evan watched her go with the quiet attention of a parent who never quite stopped monitoring his child's safety. She's remarkable, Malene said. She's the best thing I've ever done. The engineering, the degrees, the career I used to have, none of it comes close. I think I'm beginning to understand that. Evan gathered his notebook and his small bag of tools, preparing to end his shift. For what it's worth, Miss Cross, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who got very good at one way of seeing the world, and the world kept rewarding you for it. It's hard to question something that keeps working until it doesn't. Until it doesn't. He extended his hand and she shook it, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his choices. Thank you, Evan, for everything. Thank you for listening. He walked out of the mechanical room, collected Lucy from her waiting spot in the corridor, and headed toward the elevator with his daughter's hand in his. Malene watched them go, the man in gray coveralls, and the girl with the oversized backpack until the elevator doors closed and they disappeared from view. The months that followed brought changes to Hartwell Tower that would have been unthinkable before the crisis. Malene restructured her approach to problem-solving, creating channels for input from employees at every level of the organization. She started holding monthly sessions where anyone could raise concerns or offer suggestions regardless of their position or credentials. The janitors and security guards and maintenance workers, who had always been invisible, began to emerge as sources of insight that the credentialed experts had overlooked. Evan continued his night shifts, continued raising Lucy, continued maintaining the quiet rhythms of a life chosen rather than settled for. But something had shifted in him as well. He had spent years hiding his capabilities, protecting himself from expectations he wasn't sure he could meet from a world that might demand more than he was willing to give. The crisis had forced him out of that hiding, and he had discovered that visibility was not the burden he had feared. He started teaching informal sessions for the building's maintenance staff, sharing the system's knowledge he had accumulated over years of patient observation. He began documenting his insights in ways that others could use, creating a resource that would outlast his own tenure. He found satisfaction in helping others see what he had always seen, in passing along the gift of attention that had been his greatest asset. Lucy grew, as children do, in increments that were invisible day to day, but startling in aggregate. She learned to ask questions not just about the building, but about the people inside it, developing her father's gift for seeing beneath surfaces. She stopped accepting that some people were just anything, and she challenged her classmates and teachers when they made assumptions based on jobs or appearances. The phrase "just a janitor" disappeared from Hartwell Tower's vocabulary, not through any official mandate, but through the natural erosion of an idea that no longer fit the shared understanding of the community. People still had titles, still occupied different positions in the organizational hierarchy, but the titles no longer carried the weight of complete definition. A janitor could be an engineer, an executive could be wrong, a child could understand things that adults had forgotten. On the anniversary of the crisis, Malene found Evan in his usual spot in the 41st floor mechanical room. She had brought coffee, 2 cups from the expensive cafe on the ground floor, a small gesture that acknowledged the distance they had traveled from their first encounter. 1 year, she said, handing him a cup. 1 year, the building's running better than it ever has. The consultants we hired for the upgrade can't figure out why our efficiency numbers are so much higher than their projections. Evan smiled. Buildings are like people. They perform better when someone pays attention to them. I've been thinking about that, about attention, about all the things we miss because we're looking in the wrong direction. And I think the biggest mistake I made wasn't dismissing you. It was being so certain about what I already knew that I couldn't recognize what I didn't know. The phrase, "just a janitor," wasn't really about you. It was about me, about my need to categorize the world into people who mattered and people who didn't. Evan nodded slowly. That's a hard thing to see in yourself. It took you solving an impossible problem to make me see it. I wonder how many other lessons I've missed because I wasn't paying attention. Probably a lot. but that's true for everyone. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to keep learning. Lucy appeared in the doorway. Older now, taller. Her backpack still slightly too large for her frame, but carried with more confidence. "Daddy!" Grandma called. "She says dinner's at 6, and you shouldn't be late. Tell her we're on our way." Lucy disappeared again, and Evan began gathering his things. Milene watched him, seeing not a janitor, not an engineer, not a category at all, but simply a person, a father who had made choices and lived with them, who had helped when help was needed, and asked for nothing in return. "Evan," she said as he reached the door. He turned back. "You said once that the people who matter see you. I want you to know that I see you now, not as a janitor or an engineer or anything else, just as you." He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that didn't require words. Then he nodded once, the same small acknowledgement he had given on the day they first met, and walked out to join his daughter. The building hummed around Milene as she stood alone in the mechanical room, listening to the systems that Evan had taught to trust themselves again. She thought about all the people she had overlooked, all the capabilities she had dismissed, all the assumptions that had shaped her vision without her awareness, and she made herself a promise, quiet and binding, that she would spend the rest of her career trying to see what she had trained herself not to see. Because no one was just anything. Not a janitor, not an executive, not a child asking questions in a plastic chair. Every person contained multitudes, hidden depths, and unexpected gifts. Capabilities that revealed themselves only to those patient enough to look. The building knew this now. Its people knew this. And in the end, that knowledge was worth more than any credential, any title, any system of categories that humans had ever devised. It was simply the truth waiting to be recognized by anyone willing to pay attention.